This is Tall Tale TV, your podcast for sci-fi and fantasy short stories. Of Tyrants and Teakettles by Lesley Herron. Chapter 17, Allium. A white-hot supernova of light shattered the darkness, searing into the very soul of the sleeping man. Vel shot upright with enough force to launch his covers to the end of the bed. His body bolted straight into fight mode, ready to take on whatever had caused the apparent explosion. Sleep, as a general rule, is a rare commodity that Vel wasn't used to being spoiled with. From the moment his head had hit that plush pillow, he had been plagued with nightmares and violent flashbacks. It wasn't until his room was blanketed in a gentle shade of pink that a truly restful sleep had finally found him. And then, mere minutes later, Piper had barged in, marching across the length of the room and grabbing handfuls of the yellowing linen curtains. With a yank, the blinding rays of golden sunrise had cut through the room and right into Vel's half-closed eyes. The morning glow reflected off the dusty chandelier, delivering pinpoint spots of light around the room and tiny rainbows flickering off every surface. "Wake up, old man! I'm famished and could use some grub." Piper's voice broke over the silence of the morning like a whip crack. The crisp morning air was bracing against Vel's bare legs, with his blanket at the end of the bed and his borrowed nightshirt going to just above his knees. He moved to return the sheets to his body, using one hand to shield his eyes from the abrasive sunlight. He shook away the fog from his head, allowing the girl to come into focus. What are you doing up so early?" Piper fell back on her heels, her shoulder hitting the wall as she put her hands on her hips. "Well, it's really hard to sleep with your snoring. 5 rooms between us, and you still manage to rattle the walls." A smile pulled at the corner of her features, illuminating her face. Vel rolled his eyes. "It can't be that bad."
"Average noise level over past 8 hours, 78.4 decibels.
With a grumble, Vel whisked this information away with a swipe of his hand.
"All right, fine, I'm up."
He slid out of the bed, his feet hitting the cold floor. The shiver that traveled up his body did little to hide the loud rumbling of his stomach.
Maybe we should find something to eat."
"That's what I like to hear."
Piper reached over and tugged against a velvet rope that was hidden between the curls of the yellow curtains. The tiny sound of chiming resonated throughout the rest of the house, and only a moment later, the shuffling of feet told her that the bell had done its job. Sebastian entered the room with a curt bow.
"Good morning, sir. Mom, how may I be of assistance?"
Vel opened his mouth to inquire about breakfast, but Piper beat him to it.
"We're awfully hungry. Would you be so kind as to bring us something to eat?"
A smile pulled against the bristles of Sebastian's well-kept mustache.
"Of course, Mom."
He gave another brief bow, and in a swish of his coattails, he was gone. Vel struggled to stifle a yawn as he reached for his clothes. Instead of his previous night's attire, he found they had been replaced with a stack of crisp, folded garments. He recalled Sebastian commenting on the tattered state of his ensemble and insisted on furnishing him with something less destitute, as the old man had called it. Vel had begrudgingly conceded, even though his pants were haphazardly stitched up one leg where the good doctor had tore into them, and his shirt was stained a myriad of colors from the sap of the plant beast. The pile of clothes, that must have been delivered during his restless night, consisted of a pair of dark slacks, a white button-up shirt, and a black vest. Vel frowned at them as he slid on the slacks beneath his nightshirt. The fabric was soft, yet thick and richly woven. He turned his back on Piper as he pulled off one shirt to try on the other, following it up with the vest. The clothes fit perfectly, without being baggy, but still allowing room to move, except that they were far more foppish than he would have liked. Piper laughed as she watched him struggle with the buttons on the vest.
"You've gone all fancy on me."
"Except I look like a puffed-up penguin."
Vel let out a sigh as he scanned the room for his coat. It had disappeared along with his other clothes.
"Where's my jacket? I told him to leave it."
Piper scuffed a toe against the ground.
Look, I know how much you love that old jacket of yours, and since I was up anyway...
She walked over to a cabinet near the door and retrieved a bundle.
I found this shop willing to do a rush order and had this made for you.
She gave the garment a shake, and a long red duster unfurled before him. It was almost the same shade of red as his former and much-loved coat, with fewer buckles and snaps than his current one. On the lapel was an embroidered emblem of a mechanical hand, gears, and a wing, done in shimmering gold thread. Vel felt a rare spark of joy in his gut, and his mouth hung ajar as he pulled the coat from her hands to examine it. This was, without a doubt, the most generous gift he had ever been bestowed with.
I mean...
His eyebrows pulled together as he looked back up at her.
Wow, thanks, kid.
Piper scoffed.
Don't just stand there holding it like an idiot. Try it on.
Vel slid his arms through the sleeves and tugged at the lapels to position it. He grinned. This was exactly the kind of jacket he would have picked out himself. Piper nodded her approval.
Not too shabby. Now you can stop whinging on about your old one.
Vel chuckled and was about to retort when Sebastian shuffled back into the room, presenting them with a platter of food. Well, the food was on a platter, at least. Separated between 2 plates were 4 small eggs, a halved apple, a slice each of what smelled like bacon, and a short pitcher of orange juice. Sebastian sank into a half bow.
My apologies, but Master Elias has instructed us to limit the amount of food served. I'm sorry there isn't more.
Vel grabbed the bacon and offered the butler a shrug.
This is more than I've had in the last few days, so it's fine by me.
Sebastian nodded and turned to Piper. Mom, this arrived for you this morning while you were out. Piper took the letter with a frown of confusion. Who would have known where she was? Unless it was from her brother. Her name stood alone on the front, written in large, loopy letters. She flipped it over, and on the back, where the edges of the envelope were sealed, was a symbol of a book and a feather, stamped into a pool of golden wax. Her heart sank, and she ripped open the letter. Her eyes scanned over the single sentence written inside. Do you know where your brother is right now? Piper's stomach dropped. We have to go! Vel had just tore off a chunk of the bacon when he saw the girl dart out of the room.
What?
He looked down at the remainder of the untouched food on the platter, and his stomach gave another hungry rumble. Shoveling the remaining bacon and a full egg into his mouth, he glanced up at Sebastian and spoke around his mouthful.
Save it for me. I'll be back for it.
He swiped the apple halves off the plate and tore off after Piper. She was already halfway across the lawn of statues, vaulting down the path in her haste to make it to the pristine elevator. It only took Vel a moment to catch back up to her, still clutching the chunks of apple in his hands and swallowing hard to force the food down.
What was that all about?
Piper wrenched the key from her own pockets and slammed it into the hidden lock. The glass doors swung open without a sound. She hauled Vel inside and cranked it back on the lever.
Chester has Atticus!
Elias stretched his back with a loud groan. He pulled his eyes away from the sheet of paper he had been staring at for the last 20 minutes to stand, and he began pacing around the large room to loosen up the stiffness in his joints. Their workshop had been converted from what had once been used as a classroom. The individual desks had been pushed against the front of the room to be replaced by several large tables, which were now laden down with remnants of Atticus's portal machine. The walls were hidden behind rows of chalkboards and plastered with pinned-up schematics. Every available inch of black slate was covered in the furious scribbles of manic math equations and probability percentages. Several electric lights were humming above, all too happy to illuminate the madness contained within the room. The sheer amount of chaos erupting around him was enough to make even Elias's head spin. Berg was zipping from table to table, calling out identification numbers or double-checking specs. Comedy was sorting metal components by size, stopping every so often to pull off a missed piece of gooey plant beast. Tragedy was circling the table, tagging, cataloging, and arranging every item passed to him. Elias had just pressed his fingers to his temple when he heard shouting coming from the hall. He had barely a moment to glance up when the heavy metal door burst open. Piper stormed into the room, while Vel held back a pair of struggling soldiers in the hallway. One of the guards managed to free himself from Vel and charged in after Piper.
"You're not allowed in there! Stop!"
Elias waved his hand dismissively.
"These two are fine. Go back to your posts."
He turned to apologize to Piper, but she was dashing around the room, paying no attention to him.
Atticus, are you in here?
She spun on Elias, causing both Comedy and Tragedy to take a protective step forward.
Where's my brother?
Elias glanced around the shop, tucking his hands into the pockets of his slacks.
"Well, he was here just a minute ago. I don't—"
He's missing then?
Piper was looking frantic.
Oh, I'm going to break every bone in his body.
Her fingers curled into fists at her sides. Elias looked shocked.
"Your brother?"
Vel walked up beside the Inquisitor.
"No, we think someone may have kidnapped him."
"Someone's been kidnapped?"
Atticus's voice rang out from the doorway.
"Oh, hey, Piper. I'm glad you came back. I was worried."
Piper ran past Elias and Vel to throw her arms around Atticus.
"You were worried? Where were you?"
Atticus lifted up a copper kettle.
"Elias showed me this new drink called coffee, and I had to make a fresh pot."
He gave his sister a warm smile.
"Did you know this is my favorite type of tea kettle?"
As Piper started berating her brother for not telling anyone where he had gone, Elias collapsed into a chair with a weary sigh and gave the cyborg a worried look.
"Well, it's never a dull moment around you two."
He pushed a hand against the throb in his left temple once more.
"Kidnapped? What would make you think that?"
Vel wavered on the spot, unsure how much to tell him. He chewed his tongue for a long moment as he pieced together the words.
"I think someone was just trying to scare Piper, but it might not be a bad idea to keep another guard or two around."
Elias nodded. "Consider it done." Happy to have a moment to breathe, he reached for his chipped cup and drained it of its contents. Vel glanced down at the man and realized just how haggard he looked. Dark circles had settled in under his eyes, and the neat tail that held his long hair in place was unraveling. His work clothes were smeared with grease, ink, and sprinkled with chalk dust.
"Looks like you've had a long night. Everything okay?"
Elias gave a sarcastic chuckle and tossed his hands up in another dismissive wave.
"I'm afraid finding the solution to this problem may take a few more nights than I had hoped. Certain things just aren't adding up."
He stifled another yawn. Vel had seen this ragged look on his own brother many times. He clapped the Inquisitor on the shoulder and offered him a half-smile.
"I appreciate all this effort, no matter how long it takes. Without you two, I have no chance of getting back at all."
Across the room, Piper looked over her brother, pushing him out to arm's length. Underneath his lopsided hat, his hair was a disheveled tangle, and a dark shadow hung low beneath his eyes. But there was a smile on his face, regardless of the yawn escaping his lips. He lifted the steaming pot to pour the dark liquid into 2 cups. She gave him a motherly look.
"Have you been up all night?"
Atticus nodded.
"Well, I think we're getting closer. We just have 2 more bins worth of cataloguing to do, and then we can really start to tackle the math."
Piper ran her fingers through his hair, trying to straighten it. She pulled the kettle from his hands and set it down.
"No more coffee. You know what happens when you don't sleep properly. Promise me you will get at least a few hours rest after I leave."
Atticus waved her away with a hand and picked up one of the filled mugs. He turned and walked back over to his half-scribbled chalkboard.
Oh, I'm fine. Just need a few more pots of this stuff. He paused to lift his cup. And I'll be wide awake again.
Piper grabbed hold of Berg as he rolled past and pulled him close, conspiratorially.
Berg, did you bring any of his sleep tea?
Of course, Mom.
Can you slip some into his drink without his knowledge?
Berg glanced over to the boy, who was chugging the dark liquid as if it was water. Certainly, Mom. I'll be most discreet.
Piper breathed a sigh of relief. Thanks.
She studied the middle man for a moment before turning to glance back at her brother.
One other thing. I think someone might want to hurt Atticus. Would you keep an eye on him and try to protect him?
If robots could look offended, Berg would have looked stricken. His head snapped back. Of course, Mom. He then leaned in, scrutinizing her with his beady eyes. That goes without saying. I don't serve the young master because I have to. I choose to, because he is my friend, and I would gladly risk my life for him. Piper pulled away a little. The sentiment was delivered with an icy edge, as if he was upset at her for even having to ask such a question. She shook aside the feeling and patted Berg on one of his tiny arms.
I'm glad he's got you as a friend.
As the robot zipped off, presumably to enact his portion of the plan, Piper walked up to Vel, who was deep in conversation with the Inquisitor. She put a hand on his sleeve and gave him a tug.
Excuse me, gentlemen, but I need to borrow Gramps here. We've got an overdue library book that needs to be returned.
Chester wasn't at all surprised to see Theodosia escorting Piper and her fascinating companion into the room. In fact, he had set out a small platter of refreshments, though he had forgone the wine this time. One encounter with a drunken cyborg had been enough. He leaned back in his chair and crossed one leg over the other.
Ah, welcome back. I see you've got my note. How is the aviary district, by the way? I've always wanted to go.
He flourished his hand towards the table, inviting them to join him. Piper grasped the tray of food and flipped it, flinging the contents into Chester's face and all down his shirt.
You insufferable piece of garbage!
He retrieved a handkerchief from the inside of his coat and dabbed hummus out of his eyes.
I suppose I had that coming. Still, we are in the middle of a food shortage.
He looked down at his fine clothes with a small sigh. Piper chucked the brown paper letter across the table.
Cut the crap, Chester. You threatened my brother. You're lucky I didn't brain you with that serving tray.
Vel grunted his agreement and crossed his arms over his chest.
Threatened?
Chester put on a shocked expression as he continued to clean bits of food from his person.
I did no such thing. I was merely letting you know that I was wise to his whereabouts. Anything else you gleaned from that note was purely conjecture on your part.
Piper narrowed her eyes.
I know your tactics. I used to be one of your goons, remember?
Chester nodded, that lazy smile going nostalgic.
You were quite the Spitfire, and what a flair. I once had hopes that you would take over this whole operation.
The smile faded from his face as his bright blue eyes turned cold. Of course, that was before you tried to cheat me. Vel raised an eyebrow.
Cheat you? In what way?
Chester gave a dramatic sigh and tucked the handkerchief back into his pocket.
Well, my dear muscle-brained friend, that's what I call it when people try to run away.
He pulled his gaze away from the cyborg and trained it on the girl.
Without paying me.
Piper raised her shoulders high and looked around.
Last time I checked, we were still in the city. Or have you lost your touch?
Chester's smile flatlined.
You missed the part where I know what you are building, and I am well aware that should you manage to get such a device working, I am not likely to find you again to square our debt, am I?
Both Vel and Piper shifted uneasily. Chester's lips curled back into their natural grin.
That's what I thought. Luckily, I have an insider who is instructed to sabotage your brother's efforts.
He held up a hand at the sudden onset of rage in Piper's face.
Nothing drastic, mind you, just enough to keep them scratching their heads. And for no longer than a week. Any more than that, and the High Inquisitor may grow suspicious.
Vel ground his teeth in exasperation.
Great! So we have a week to pay you back. How do you expect us to do that?
Chester flourished his hand at the cyborg.
I don't. So consider that I am willing to cut my losses, in lieu of something else, as a favor.
Piper let out a low sigh and closed her eyes. What do you want?
I want the aviary district.
Piper's eyes snapped open. Is that it? Deal! She reached into a pocket and pulled out the shiny key and the stamped piece of parchment Elias had given them. A key to the Inquisitor's private elevator and a pass to the city. Chester scoffed and waved away the items. He pressed his fingertips together and leaned back in his chair.
If I wanted a day pass, I would forge my own. No, what I want is unfettered access to the city. You two have landed yourself in a very fortuitous position. As personal guests of the High Inquisitor himself, you can go places nobody else would normally be allowed.
The smile returned to his face.
I want you to discover a weakness, an entry point for me to expand my organization to the streets above. I want to sink my claws into every business, every accountant, butler, and washing maid.
He slapped his hand against the arm of his chair.
I want to rule the elite, without them even knowing it has happened.
Piper slid into one of the chairs set out for them, lest her knees give out beneath her. That place is locked up tighter than a nun's habit. I spent a whole day trying to find my way back down and couldn't figure it. Aside from the fact that it's treason, how do you expect us to do that? Chester spread his hands wide.
If I knew that, I wouldn't be offering it to you as a way to settle your debt. But, on the bright side, you do have a week to figure it out.
The tone of condescension was enough to make Piper gag. She pressed her fingers against her lips. And if we refuse? Chester managed a look of concern.
Well, in that case, someone might accidentally slip to the council about all the little talks I've had with your brother, which, I do believe, is treason.
His contrived manner evaporated, replaced with a sinister grin.
Or have I lost my touch?
Of Tyrants and Teakettles is Book 2 of the ongoing Sci-Fantasy series by author Lesley Herron. Join us as the adventure unfolds, with new chapters releasing every few weeks.
Are you positive you've accounted for the ionic bonding in that equation?
Absolutely! See, it's right. Oh, thank you, Berg. My pleasure, sir. What was I saying? Oh, yeah, it's right there! Otherwise, there would be no value for the valence electron transfer in this one over here.
Then the problem can't be in this portion of the math. Did you try... Atticus, are you alright? Atticus?